Hello, everyone. Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out today. My name is Terry Reed. I'm the executive director here at the Northport Historical Society and Museum. And today we are so pleased to host a Sunday at the Society in honor of Black History Month with this engaging program, Living on Common Ground, a new look at Northport's Black history. And we are honored to have members of the Huntington African American Museum in our audience. Our speaker, Jaylon Swenson, today is an East Northport native. She received her BA from Sarah Lawrence College and completed her senior thesis while studying abroad at Wadham College, University of Oxford. Jaylon began her journey here in 2020 when she wanted to discover more about the history of Northport and East Northport. She joined us here as a research assistant and a museum educator. And while here, she created the Northport Black History Walking Tour and wrote several articles for our blog on the topic. She currently works in the administration of the Museum of the City of New York and continues to research Long Island and New York history. And we're so proud of all she's accomplished and know she has a bright future. So everyone, please welcome Ms. Jaylon Swenson.
Good afternoon, everybody. Okay. Hopefully we can do this with the technology. So we have a lot to get through in the next 40 minutes. We are going to blast through the key points and illustrative anecdotes covering the history of Northport and East Northport's historic Black communities from the 1660s to the 1960s. We will find many examples of injustice, discrimination, and hate, but despite so many odds, there was so much love. Despite the wrongs that were perpetrated, the continued disenfranchisement caused by white power structures that have permeated our community, the Black people who lived in Northport and East Northport found love here, made friends of different races here, and proudly made their mark on the whole community in many ways. While they were not always given equal rights and opportunities on this land, it was always common ground. Today, I would like to honor the people who looked out on the same waters and walked on the same rolling hills as we do today, but who were not always given the opportunity to let their roots here become as strong as they were long. I have two structural notes before we jump in. First, I try to use the identifiers African Americans and Black people in two separate ways. I try, for the most part, to use African Americans to refer to the community of people descending from enslaved Africans here in America. But I will also use the broader term Black people when I'm referring to the broader community of people of color, especially when their specific ancestry is unknown, which will be important later. Second, I am presenting to you an amalgamation of other people's research and my own. This topic has been severely understudied for 100 years. Black history research in New York State began in earnest in the 1990s. I've chosen evidence and anecdotes to illustrate the breadth of Northport's Black community, the breadth of their experiences within this community. There will be a lot of stories and deep dives that I have had to cut, and there are stories I include on purpose because they are incomplete and require further investigation and confirmation. This is because history is a living thing and it takes a village to find out all of the facts. So let us begin with the 1660s to 1827. The story of Black people in the town of Huntington goes back to its beginning. The town was established through two land purchases by English settlers from the Matinecock Native Americans in 1653 and 1656. The earliest reference to enslavement in the township that we know of right now is to about 1660. The first farms were settled in our eastern part of the town, were established in the 1670s in Crab Meadow, Fort Salonga areas. Over the course of the next 100 years, homesteads would be built along the path that would become Main Street and up to this place called 5 Points, which is the conjunction of Waterside, Main Street, Vernon Valley, and Fort Salonga. I've tried to sort of circle it over there. And then further up, of course, onto the flat plains that were referred to over the years as Larkfield, Clay Pit, and East Northport. There are a lot of things we don't know when it comes to enslaved labor in Northport. We don't know when the first enslaved people arrived or where exactly they lived. We don't know how many people gained their freedom while living here, how many of them stayed or left Huntington after that point. We don't have clear records that I know of anyone self-emancipating or running away from the Northport area within Huntington. And often we don't even know a name, we just have tally marks in a census. What we do know is that multiple families in Northport, at least by the 1700s, were enslavers. The enslaving family that we have the most information on right now, who will come up many times throughout this history, are unsurprisingly also one of the oldest, at times wealthiest, and definitely one of the most prolific across the town of Huntington. So Thomas Scudder was originally from England and was one of the first original settlers of Huntington. When he died in 1690, his son Timothy inherited large landholdings in Northport through Crab Meadow. Timothy and his wife Sarah raised 6 kids in Northport. They made their home at 5 Points, at one of what would become 2 different longtime Scudder family residences in Northport. The picture we have here is of the 1790s building. There had been a previous building at this site. The Scudder family, starting in 1710, while living at this place, enslaved a man and woman whose names were not recorded, but who were likely members of the Akan people in present-day Ghana. The couple had 3 children, Samson, Rachel, and Sterling, who all spent their early years in Northport working for and living alongside the white Scudders. Samson stayed with the Northport Scudders for his whole life. He married a Native American woman named Sarah around 1737. Their relationship is representative of the solidarity growing between enslaved Africans, African Americans, and Native Americans, which will come up again later. Together, Samson and Sarah had 5 children in Northport. In 1740, Timothy Scudder died, and his son John took over both the 5 Points homestead and the enslavement of Samson, Sarah, and their children. 2 decades later, the American colonies declared their independence from England, initiating the American Revolutionary War. The Battle of Long Island in 1776 ended with George Washington fleeing to Manhattan, the island being occupied by British soldiers, and men over the age of 15 being required to swear an oath of fealty to the crown. Patriots in Huntington resisted in whatever way they could, mostly by harassing British soldiers or fleeing to unoccupied Connecticut. Northport's Great Revolutionary War hero, Henry Scudder, refused to take the oath of fealty and escaped to Connecticut himself. We know him today for spying on the British Fort Salonga, and getting the plans for the fort to the rebels in Connecticut, allowing them to successfully capture the fort in 1781. Sergeant Elijah Churchill received one of the nation's first Purple Heart military merit badges for wounds received at that battle here in Fort Salonga. But there is another man who could have claimed the name Scudder if he had wanted it, who played a part in Huntington's resistance to British occupation. Samson and Sarah's son, Elijah, was born in Northport in 1750. He lived there until he was sold in 1770 to the widow Mary Carl Platt, who owned Platt's Tavern, which was on the corner of 25A and Park Avenue in Huntington. There is a historical marker there now. He was an accomplished fiddler who was known for his performances. And in 1779, British troops attacked the tavern. During the fight, Elijah wounded a British soldier with a hatchet, saved the life of his enslaver Mary's son, and miraculously survived a gunshot wound to the head. All of this, though, was not enough to gain Elijah his freedom in 1793 when Mary died, and he became the property of the man whose life he saved. This is where previous historians and myself for now have ended our particular research into the generations of these African-American Scudders at 5 Points. But this is not the end of the story of enslavement in Northport. We're going to go back to the heart of the town and to the harbor to look at a document here at the Northport Historical Society Museum that helps us understand how slavery impacted the whole of the village. So the Bryants are another one of Huntington's oldest families. Their name was on Northport's first business, Bryant's Landing, which was a commercial dock that in about 1800 was co-owned by 94 Huntington area stakeholders. In 1800, Northport resident Jesse Bryant appointed his attorney, David Bryant, the power to sell a man named Elijah, not the one that we were just discussing, for whatever price he saw fit. Henry Scudder witnessed the transfer of power. And according to that year's census, Scudder himself enslaved 2 people whose names are not currently known. All 3 of these men held shares in Bryant's Landing. It is important to realize that the many of the people, not all of them, but the ones who had the money to invest in a venture like Bryant's Landing also had the money to purchase humans and to benefit from their unpaid labor. And so it cannot be denied that the economic development of Northport and the economics of human slavery were intertwined. Slavery was outlawed fully in New York State in 1827. We may never know the names of all of the people whose forced labor contributed to the growth and building of Northport, but I know that I and other historians will, in the time to come, be working on finding as many of them as we can. So we get to the 1830s now. Let's take a wide lens view of Northport in the 19th century. In the 1840s, the shipbuilding industry is going to boom and put Northport on the map. This is one from the 1890s. Here's a picture from circa 1860. Most of the buildings here on Main Street that we know were built through the 19th century. Other major industries like sand mining and shell fishing, definitely brought about in a large part by Stanley Loans in the middle of that picture, would continue to build Northport's economy. The railroad came to Northport in the 1860s and 70s, connecting us west, bringing immigrants and new commercial opportunities for local farmers. And of course, in the 1890s, the Thompson Law Book Publishing Company brought an influx of white-collar workers and kicked off a rapid period of modernization and infrastructure growth in the village. The 19th century was a key period of growth for Northport. It is also, of course, the period we have the least number of archival pieces of information about Northport's Black history at that time. So we do know that from the 1830s to the 1860s, Huntington's overall free African-American community began to put down their own new roots. The Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church, which I will often refer to as AME, was established in 1843. Individuals and families that had previously lived in the American South were starting to migrate to Long Island, expanding the existing Black community in Huntington. There were many jobs available, for instance, at brickworks across Huntington and on the many farms. Many Black people were also working as domestic servants, sometimes along white co-workers in wealthy houses across the township. The Huntington Black community also had very close ties to African-American communities across the island, particularly Smithtown and Oyster Bay. So with this document, we're going to zoom back into Northport specifically. I'm going to walk you through a couple of pieces of the puzzle that we do have for Northport and East Northport's African-American communities in the 19th century. So we are very lucky here at the Northport Historical Society and Museum to have what may be the record of the first Black landowner in Northport. In 1837, a man named James Treadwell purchased approximately 12 acres of land near Main Street. And we have the confirmation of when he paid off his mortgage in 1848, which we all know is a wonderful thing to happen. We know that Mr. Treadwell was considered Black because he is referred to in this legal document as, quote, James Treadwell, comma, colored man. So his, nobody else's race is mentioned in this document. And so you understand that it is important and notable that he is purchasing land at this time. He is listed in the 1840 Huntington census, which indicates that at that time, he was between 24 and 36 years old, and he was employed navigating canals, lakes, or rivers. So we will hopefully find out more about Mr. Treadwell with future research. But for now, I'd like to recognize him as one of the first Black men to, of his own free will, choose to be part of our community. While Mr. Treadwell was working on waterways, other Black people were participating in farming that was East Northport's main industry for most of its history. Another document here at the Northport Historical Society Museum gives an insight into the childhoods of African Americans in this period. The Clay Pit Schoolhouse tallied the students' attendance each quarter. 2 children, Jack and Warren, are identified by their race with no last names given. Jack spent more time at school than Warren, but both of their tallies are pretty average compared to their white peers. It can be inferred that much of the time that these children were not at school, they were all working in some capacity on farms across East Northport. We may find out more about these boys in the future, but of course, what is infuriating about this document is that they are only listed by their race and with no last names that would be helpful for further research. And we will see if we can one day get more information about them. I'm really hoping so. In the aftermath of enslavement, many formerly enslaved people and their descendants continued to do similar jobs for wages. They did not have a head start on accruing generational wealth in the way that many white families had done. This is part of why so many Black residents continued to make careers in domestic service. The Huntington Historical Society has very few images of Black people before the 1900s. Those that have been gathered often lack useful metadata. We have this photo of the Sammis family in the 1890s, and it refers to their Black employees as Nanny and Aunt Liza, cook. There's a slight chance that Nanny could be a nickname for somebody who was Anne and then Nan, but this woman is holding the side of a stroller, so we really can't even, I don't think we should take that into consideration. Clearly, the family did not remember or possibly never knew the last names of the people who worked for them, meaning the people who came after and wrote down the identifications later on in life. Further research could perhaps find these women's names, but without their last names right now, it will be very difficult. In the 1850s, tension rose across America due to the continued existence of enslavement in other states. This, of course, reached its boiling point in April 1861 with the outbreak of the Civil War. The war and the subsequent passing of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, abolishing slavery or indentured servitude, changed the lives of millions of Black people living across the country and the country itself forever. National emancipation spurred a migration of African Americans to the North and brought Huntington more new residents. This great upheaval and time of change sets the stage for the active and autonomous period of Northport's African American community. To that end, I must mention Mr. Samuel Bolton, Greenlawn's Pickle King, who some of you have probably heard of. He was born into slavery in Virginia, joined the Union Army as a cook, risked his own freedom by traveling back and forth across Virginia 3 times until he had freed his wife, Rebecca, and eventually the two of them settled in Greenlawn in 1873. He gained fame in the 1880s for, in one season, gathering more than 1 million pickling cucumbers, although he had a vast career doing many other jobs that I can't get into right now. What I want to bring up, and the reason I have this image of Samuel Bolton, is to refer to the fact that he was the only African-American member of the Northport chapter of the Grand Army of the Republic, which is a no longer existent, for the purpose of what it is, fraternity. It was a fraternity specifically of Union soldiers. And so, as you can see here, he is one of the only, he's the only Black man, and he is one at this point in the 1910s of only about 20 of them left. There's one story of this period that I believe is a unique window into the complex dimensions of Black identity in Northport, and an incredibly rare insight into the delicate topic of interracial relationships in this period. In 2021, when I was first starting in on this research, I was interested to notice that there was a man who was listed as Black in the 1900 US federal census, and then listed with his race as M for mulatto in 1910, mulatto now being an outdated term for a mixed race person. I paused not at the M, but at this man's name, which was Townsend Scudder, and he was born in 1854. He caught my attention because there was a famous white man of the same name who was born a little while later, whose great-grandfather was the Revolutionary War Henry Scudder. The white Townsend Scudder was, among other things, Long Island Parks commissioner in the 1920s who supported Robert Moses. Now, it's not rare at all to find African Americans on Long Island who adopted the last names of their former enslavers. But this surname, paired with the indication that this person was possibly mixed race, encouraged me to look a little deeper. And so as we discuss this for the sake of clarity, I will be referring to the Black Townsend Scudder and the white Townsend Scudder. The Black Townsend Scudder had a brother named George Alonzo Scudder. Their mother, Hannah Katoris Fraser, was born in Shinnecock Hills in Southampton in 1813. And according to her obituary, she was full-blooded Shinnecock. She's listed in Huntington censuses as Black, but that isn't always a good indicator of things because different federal censuses did or did not have an indicator for being Native American. And so because the person who was filling out the census was the one who would put down, whatever you wanted, they were not always responding to how individuals would actually identify. Whatever the case may have been, Hannah married an African-American man, and together they had a daughter in 1843. So then the question is, where does the Scudder connection come? Jesse Platt Scudder was born in Northport in 1810. He was a white person who was married in 1842, and according to the census, lived in Brooklyn around the 1850s. Hannah's sons were born in 1854 and 1855, respectively. George lists his birthplace as Jericho. Their father is listed as Jesse Scudder on George's marriage record of 1909 and on Townsend's death record in 1945, which is not visible here. So there are clearly many pieces of this puzzle missing. There were other African-American Scudders living in Northport and across Long Island at this time and at other times. Perhaps there was an African-American Jesse Scudder that I have not found. There's absolutely fully a chance of that. The only reason that I would particularly think that Jesse Platt may have been their father is because of Townsend and George Alonzo's first names. Townsend was the name of Jesse Platt Scudder's uncle, and George Alonzo was the name of Jesse Platt Scudder's brother. So assuming that for a minute that the white Jesse Platt Scudder was Hannah Katoris's partner in those years, they would have named their children after his very close relatives. So questions that we may never answer include, had this been a consensual relationship? Could Hannah have had African ancestry? Why did they choose to continue they had two children together when they were both in their 40s? You may be thinking, does this story even belong in a Black history lecture if Hannah was actually Native American? So beyond this story's connection to the long history of solidarity and intermarriage between Native Americans and people of African ancestry in America in general, what is clear is that in this case, even if the mixed Townsend Scudder and George Alonzo Scudder were not African American, they fully aligned themselves with the Black community wherever they lived. They both married African-American women, and they had children who, if we take the Jesse Platt Scudder connection for granted, would have had African, Native American, and European ancestry. So who was this Townsend Scudder? He was a regular guy. He was an unassuming person who had just a life here in Northport, which is why as far as I know, and I hope somebody will correct me in a little bit, I haven't heard anything about this story before. Townsend seems to have led a quiet life with his wife, Anna, and their two daughters, Flory and Etta. He made his living as a chauffeur for the Cockcroft family in Northport for many years. From 1900 to the mid-1910s, he lived at 106 Bayview Avenue with Etta and her husband, Melville Woodhull, and their children. Townsend's stepson, Elliot Smith, lived next door at 108 Bayview with his wife and kids. Townsend spent 12 years of his later life living in Huntington and working as the sexton at St. John's Church on Huntington's Main Street. He could probably have heard the news about his white counterpart as he became a U.S. congressman, a Suffolk County district judge, and Long Island Parks commissioner, but we will never know if Hannah's son ever met the white Townsend Scudder before he died in 1945. Thus, for such a little town, the individuals of the identities of the individuals within Northport's small African-American community were by no means uniform. What is clear is that Northport's African-American community by 1900, whoever was a part of that community, was ready to make a space for themselves within the village at that point. And so the bedrock of that change would come in the form of the Allen African Methodist Episcopal Church. And now we enter the 20th century. According to the 1900 census, there were 113 people listed as Black living in Northport and East Northport. That number includes families and single people, adults and children. Many were employed as domestic servants, laborers, and quite a few women worked independently as laundresses. The vast majority were at least second-generation New Yorkers. 45 people lived with their white employers. Many lived on the east side of Bayview Avenue, on Woodbine Avenue, and on School Street. African Americans in Northport and East Northport were part of many of the nearby parishes, everything from the First Presbyterian Church, established in 1785, to St. Philip Neri, established in 1894. Some, of course, attended the Bethel AME farther away in the heart of Huntington. By 1901, there were enough committed African Methodists in Northport to found the Allen AME Mission and begin fundraising for their own church in town. The creation of this church was a manifestation of faith, but it was also a sign that Northport's African American community felt empowered to take up space here. So from 1901 to 1907, the project fundraised slowly with events like a concert held in Union Hall, aka the Union Opera House. And the church received the final $500 that they needed through a loan from the prolific Long Island real estate developer, William B. Codling. And it's perhaps not a coincidence that in 1900, he employed one Ms. Jenny Pollard, who was married by Reverend William H. Coffey, who from 1913 to 1915 would be pastor of both Huntington and Northport AME churches. In 1908, Reverend William B. Derrick, Bishop of the First District AME Church, laid the Allen AME's cornerstone at their property on Church Street. Northport's older churches supported the Allen AME from its earliest days and continued to do so through its existence. In 1908, the congregants of Northport's First Presbyterian Church donated their hymn books to the new church. And at the building's dedication in 1909, the choir from St. Paul's Methodist Episcopal sang. It is exactly this time that Northport's most famous African-American resident came to the town of Huntington. Booker T. Washington was born into slavery in 1856 in Virginia. And he put himself through school after emancipation and became the head of the now famous Tuskegee Institute, Tuskegee University in Alabama in 1881. The Institute became one of the first colleges for African Americans and represented Washington's belief that African Americans would improve their status in the country through technical education and hard work. In 1901, Washington's autobiography, Up From Slavery, became a bestseller and brought him national fame. He's considered by some to have been the most powerful African American of the 19th century, or one of them. Starting in 1907, Washington began renting summer homes in Huntington as a base of operations to have his wife, Margaret, and his children stay while he was fundraising up and down the Northeast for his school. In 1911, he decided to buy a summer home in Fort Salonga on Cousins Lane for the same purpose. The Washingtons would continue to come to this house until it was sold in 1914. For the most part, the Washingtons were accepted by their white neighbors. At some point, a rumor started that he would create another institute in Fort Salonga, causing some neighbors to offer to buy him out of the Cousins Lane property and get him a different one further down the Sound, according to the New York Times. There is no particular evidence that Washington was in Fort Salonga for anything but rest, access to the beach, and access to wealthy donors, and so he did not sell the property. Washington was certainly accepted by the pastors of First Presbyterian and St. Paul's Methodist because he is believed to have given sermons at both churches. He also reportedly taught Sunday school at Bethel AME. Now, again, between 1913 and 1915, both of the Huntington and Northport AMEs shared one pastor, the aforementioned Reverend William H. Coffey. So while we don't know for certain that the Washingtons attended services here in Northport, it seems likely that he would have at least gone to a few. While his presence was significant to all, I believe that Booker T. Washington's greatest impact may have been on the African American youth of Northport. So let's meet Thomas Wood Jr. He was born in Oyster Bay in 1902 and was living in Northport with his father, Thomas Sr., his little sister Mary, and their stepmom, Harriet Mitchell, in 1906. Starting around 1910, he was a live-in servant for the family of Northport dentist Dr. Frank Quackenbush, while also completing his primary education. He was not the only child to have this experience in Northport. If you go through the census, you will find children as young as 10 or 9 also living with their employers, their white employers. But he is the only person to have left any account of that experience. Thomas completed chores in exchange for his room and board. The Quackenbushes were impressed by Tom's intelligence and clearly did see him as more than a mere laborer. And while this was positive, it also caused him social discomfort. For instance, when the Quackenbushes would sometimes ask him to dine with them, they put young Thomas in an awkward position of having to politely turn him down. According to oral histories conducted in the 1990s by Thelma Jackson Abadali for her book, African Americans in Northport, An Untold Story, Thomas knew that though he had a close relationship with the Quackenbushes, African Americans were primarily accepted as servants and employees and not as social equals. It is this young man who was already working hard and showing academic merit who was likely sitting in church with Booker T. Washington and perhaps dreamed of being a leader like the man in front of him. Tom continued to excel academically. He was also on the high school basketball team and was part of student government. He did both of these latter activities with his best friend, Frank Scudder. This is the last time we will be hearing about this family. We have no way of knowing if Frank was aware that his ancestor, Timothy, had enslaved Black people in the same town, miles away from where he probably walked around and, did horsing around with Tom Wood, less than 300 years before. But their relationship as peers and as, according to Tom Wood, close friends, illustrates the changes that had come to Northport in those centuries. After becoming the first African-American graduate of the modern Northport High School in 1921, Tom matriculated at Howard University, another one of America's historically Black universities. The Quackenbushes helped fund his education, but unfortunately he could only stay for 1 year. Thomas Sr. died in 1923 after a long illness, leaving Tom to help care for his stepmother and his sister. He went back to working for the Quackenbushes, where he continued to have a close personal and professional relationship with the family. He was one of 2 witnesses to Dr. Quackenbush's will and acted as a surrogate father to his grandson, Wade. Despite not completing his higher education as he wished, Thomas exemplified Booker T. Washington's principles of hard work and self-improvement. Tom kept himself intellectually stimulated by playing a lot of chess in Northport Village, engaging in public debates hosted at the Bethel AME Church, and throwing himself into organizing for the Allen AME Church here in Northport. He married Alma Phillips, who was equally committed to the Allen AME. He began working at Grumman Aerospace Corporation in 1944 and continued there until his retirement in 1966. After all of Tom's sacrifice, he and Alma were able to see both of their children graduate from college. Their daughter Frances from Oswego, where she became a teacher, and his son Thomas David Wood from what was then the Long Island Agricultural and Technical Institute in Farmingdale to become a graphic designer. Tom passed away in 1999 at the age of 97. So while in some parts of Long Island, the 1920s were roaring and glittering during Tom Wood's young adulthood, a dark force was gaining a great deal of power and influence. The Ku Klux Klan is usually thought of as a Southern organization, but it had chapters across Long Island in the 1920s and 1930s, including one here in Northport. A great deal of the Klan's vitriol was directed against the fast-growing number of Catholics on the island, but they also threatened and attacked Black and Jewish families. One of the only firsthand accounts we have on this topic from an African American comes from 6th-generation Huntingtonian Vera Groves Shorter. In the 1990s, Vera recounted to Thelma Jackson Abadali a clear childhood memory of her grandfather, Benjamin Hendrickson, warding the Klan off with a rifle here on Main Street, where his family lived. Benjamin Hendrickson was born in 1873, and he was of mixed African and Shinnecock descent. He was the 4th generation of his family to be born in the town of Huntington, the 3rd to live on Eaton's Neck. He was a veteran of the Spanish-American War and World War I, where he served as in the Navy as a first-class machinist mate, For 60 years, he made his living as a chauffeur for families in this village. He married and raised his children and grandchildren in Northport. Vera passed away in 2021, so we unfortunately don't have much more context for her memory. But what we do know is that Benjamin was ready to protect his family against anyone who had the gall to say that they were not real Americans. There are also oral histories stating that the Klan in Northport was linked to an awful attack against a family called the Kents, who were living on Mackinac Beach. In 1935, purported Klan members burned the Kent family's house down, causing this Black family to move away for fear of their safety. There is also evidence that the Klan burned at least one cross on the lawn of a Catholic family in Northport, the Smiths. We do not have many digitized copy of Northport newspapers from the 20s generally, and in particular in order to confirm if this attack or any other racially or religiously motivated ones were ever reported on. However, a fundraising journal from a Klan event in Mineola in June 1926 lists the Northport Observer as a donor. The Long Islander did cover their activity, the Klan's activity in Northport, but pretty tamely, one could say balancedly for a newspaper. Whether the Klan was being protected by local papers or if they were being intimidated into silence is difficult to know, but both cases seem pretty equally likely depending on the situation. Without further anecdotes or testimonies, it's difficult to know the full extent of the effect of the Klan's presence and racial prejudice on the lives of Black people in Northport at this time. Throughout this period of increased fear and uncertainty, the pastors of the Allen AME Church faithfully served their community, performing baptisms, marriages, and funerals, and hosting community building events like mock trials and lectures and concerts. The parish was always small, and the pastors did not stay very long. We have a small number of photos of them that were donated by Thomas Wood in the 90s. So Reverend James Manning served as pastor from 1929 to about 1936. And we have here at the Historical Society Museum, one of our only physical objects from the church is this beautiful, if you see it in real life, it really is gorgeous. It's a commemoration for donors who dedicated chairs to deceased loved ones. Reverend W.R. Bain was Reverend Manning's successor, and he was here through the 1940s. This is also a great shot of only like 2 or 3 of the interior of the church that we have at the Historical Society. Reverend Oliver B. Freeman was the pastor between 1949 and 1953. He and his daughter Nellie are featured, one of the 2 images featured in the poster for this event. And finally, the last pastor of the Allen AME Church was Reverend Herman David Floyd, seen here with his wife. Community life for African Americans, of course, reached beyond the church. Both the Northport Journal and the Northport Observer from the 30s to the 50s and 60s record the joys and woes of our African American neighbors in that time. I'm going to take this opportunity to skip around in the timeline a little bit to just give you a couple of vignettes of stories that made an impact on me and people who had extraordinary, ordinary lives. So Myrtle Phillips was born in Stony Brook in 1888, and she was a live-in servant for the farmer by the name of Scudder Arthur from the age of 9 years old until Mr. Arthur's death in 1945. But when he died, he left her $500 cash and the income of a $6,000 trust fund. She did die 2 years later in 1947, and when she did, she was buried with the Arthur family in their plot at Northport Rural Cemetery. Henry Lewis was born in 1862 and made his living for many years working on Dexter Seymour's oyster boats, and then for the house builders Vale and Call. He lived his final years in the home of Northport graduate Thomas Wood, who remembered that Henry volunteered to take care of the upkeep of the Allen AME Church. And Thomas also claimed that Henry was illiterate, but that he knew the Bible from cover to cover and could quote verses verbatim. Henry died in 1945 at age 83. Lottie Brazier, I've written thousands of words about Lottie Brazier, and it's on the blog. Lottie Brazier was born in 1909. She was the third African-American graduate of Northport High School. Her parents were both born in Smithtown. She was born here in Northport. Where Thomas Wood made his mark in student government and sports, Lottie made hers through her voice. In 1923, she was selected to be Huntington's female entry into the Suffolk County Spelling Bee. In high school, she was a prolific writer, as we can see. She penned the freshman play. She was named class poet every year of her high school career and contributed to Northport's first student newspaper, The Live Wire. As a senior, she gave a speech at the graduation entitled The World Court, which unfortunately we don't have a copy of. And she wrote the majority of the 1927 yearbook. Her yearbook, the 1927 yearbook, is a beautiful and precious piece of writing because it is currently, as far as I know, the only example of writing by an African-American in Northport in the Historical Society archives. Terry can correct me in a minute, but as far as I know, we don't have any personal letters, diaries, any records directly from the perspective of Black people in Northport other than Lottie's volcano. So it's in the back in case anybody wants to read it. And I also have a whole article about her whole family. Albert Folk and his wife Lottie Smith, not the Lottie we were just discussing, were both born in Northport in the 1880s. Lottie's parents, Elliot and Dolly, were featured on the poster for this event as well in their Edwardian clothing. And I have to say quickly, the only reason we have this identified is because the first year I did my walking tour, Miss Gloria Green, who is their great-great-granddaughter, was able to come to the society and help us identify some people in photos that hadn't been identified yet. And she and her children helped us identify this incredible photo. So Albert and Lottie had 10 children here in Northport between 1910 and 1931, all of whom grew up here, and 9 of which went through our schools. Their son, Albert Folk, Jr., was one of at least 3 African Americans in Northport to serve in the Second World War. He reached the rank of corporal and was sent to both the Pacific and European theaters and returned home safely in December 1945. His brother Arthur wrote to his former employer, Mrs. Bartow, from training camp in 1943, and she shared the contents of his letter with the Northport Journal. Apparently, he told Mrs. B that he'd never mind getting up early again after the Army made him get up at 4 a.m. every day. And Benjamin Hendrickson's grandson, Eugene Groves, was a friend of the Folk boys. And despite losing fingers in a horrific childhood accident, he was a skilled musician, just like his own mother, actually, Benjamin's daughter. Here he is alongside James Harold Folk with the 1934 Northport High School Marching Band. I just really love this. I was a marching band kid. I love this photo. Returning to the timeline for a minute, it's important to mention the African-American community that grew up around the Rothman Pickle Works in East Northport. There may have been as many, according to not particularly, sound numbers, up to 50 African Americans living seasonally in East Northport at the height of this business's operations from the 30s to the 50s. This pickling factory was founded in the 1910s, was located on the south side of the Northport train tracks. According to oral history from Keith Rothman, whose parents ran the business until it shut down in 1961, and according to census records, some of these workers lived on 9th and 10th Streets of East Northport's grid, and in at least one building on the north side of the tracks as well. The Rothmans had a complicated relationship with their employees. On the one hand, Keith remembers African-American employees praising his parents for their hard work and their, sort of hands-on attitude towards getting the pickling done. But there is also evidence that his parents neglected conditions in the buildings where their workers were living for free, causing them to be cited by the town of Huntington in the 40s and 50s. An oral history with East Northport teacher Maureen Tavola in the 2000s referred to the children of these families who attended the Larkfield Elementary School when they were not working at the pickle factory. This is yet another area of Northport's African-American history that needs a lot more research. Despite the fact that African Americans had such long roots in Northport and East Northport, the population continued to shrink through the 20th century. There are many possible reasons for this decrease. We have no statements to confirm how many of these reasons were at play, which is why I call them speculative, even though when you hear them, they will make a lot of sense. So from my perspective, these speculative reasons break down into two categories: internal forces and external forces. Internal forces would include the completely understandable desire of the children, like the Folks and the Greens and the Groveses and other African Americans who grew up in this obviously predominantly white Northport, to live their adult lives in places with a larger Black community where they might feel less alone. That is an option. Another option would be the desire that many people of every race have, which is just to not live where you grew up. That's an option. External forces include racial bias in real estate practices. The 1950s brought a huge housing and population boom to the entire town of Huntington, as we know. Most of modern East Northport was created between the 1950s and 1960s as huge swaths of farmland were bought up by developers and turned mostly into single-family homes. Elsewhere on Long Island, Levittown's exclusionary racial covenants, which made it so that homes could not be sold to people of color, were deemed unenforceable by the Supreme Court in 1945. I am not currently familiar with any evidence that houses in Northport or East Northport had exclusionary racial covenants. When we consider how few of these new homes were sold to Black people, however, what seems more likely is that real estate agents were steering Black buyers away from Northport and East Northport and towards areas like Huntington Station. Steering potential buyers to certain areas based on their race was only made illegal by the Fair Housing Act of 1968, but it was always discriminatory. Black home buyers may also have been intimidated out of purchasing homes here by unfriendly prospective neighbors. I've heard at least one third-hand anecdote to that effect that we can talk about later if anybody wants to hear about it. But whatever the reason for the population decline, the Allen AME congregation dwindled as the last generations of young congregants moved away from town. The church could not continue to raise the funds to keep up the building and support the pastors. In 1955, the Allen AME was dissolved by the AME First District. The building was sold to private residents in the 1960s. After a 50-year hiatus, Northport African Methodists returned to the Bethel AME congregation to fulfill their spiritual and social needs. In its half-century, the Allen AME Church was a source of comfort and safety for African Americans in a predominantly white town. Though after the 70s, there was little physical evidence of the African American community in Northport and East Northport, their histories were always here, in our yearbooks, in our memories, and in the pages of our newspapers. I hope that you have learned something new hearing their stories threaded together again. This is not, I'm almost done. We're so close. All right, we are here today because of Thelma Jackson Abdali, Northport's first African-American history researcher. Through the 1990s to 2010s, she worked tirelessly to gather, make available, and protect Black history in the town of Huntington, starting here in her adopted hometown. She wrote African Americans in Northport: An Untold Story, which is one of the key resources for this lecture and for this whole process for me. She was inspired to do this work because she knew it was important to commemorate Booker T. Washington's presence in Northport, and also because, as she said in the Long Island History Journal in 2013, that as a person who had migrated from the South to Long Island, she wanted a, quote, sense of pride and a feeling of belonging in a community, not merely as an intruder in someone else's town. She also took time out of her busy schedule as a working mother of 2 kids. And by the way, she worked for the school district. She was an administrator here. She took time out of her own life to go to each of the Northport East Northport elementary schools and give an annual presentation on Northport's Black history. I heard her speak in 2008. Somehow I was the only person of all of my friends who grew up who remembered this happening. It was a little weird, or at least just mentally for me. I'm like, guys, come on. We were all there together. Don't you remember? And then I got to speak to her about it in 2021 when she confirmed that that had been her. And her example helped inspire me to do this work starting in 2021. If you don't want Thelma's work to end with me, I have 3 requests. The first is to support your local history museums. Here, the Northport Historical Society and Museum, and who, thank you, were so gracious to host this lecture, but we also have 2 trustees of the still building right now, Huntington African American History Museum in Huntington. They're here. Do you guys want to wave? Say hi. Woo! Yes, thank you. This is extraordinary. It's been decades in the making. So please support them, check in with them, see what they need, be there for them. The second thing is to start thinking of other more central places that could be venues to commemorate Northport's African-American history. I don't live in the village. I don't actually live here anymore. So I can only say this in a general sense, but I don't know, a historical marker at 5 Points commemorating the birthplace of Elijah, who, fought the occupying forces during the revolution, could be nice. I don't know. Let's think about it. And finally, if any of these topics you heard today interest you, or you're just getting inspired to dive into whether it's Northport's African-American history, or if you're saying, wait a minute, what about Northport's women's history? What about Northport's Ukrainian history? I don't know. We have a particular Croatian community, and we know that for real. Do it, please. If you start going into the historical data, please contact me if you need ideas for tips and tricks of where to start with local history, because this work, local history, cannot be exclusive or exclusionary. We welcome anybody who wants to honor our common ground together. Is that Mr. Lights?
Yes.
We were wondering if, Barry, we were wondering if you'd like to say a few words about the Huntington African American History Museum project. Please, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that wonderful presentation. I know a lot of work went into it to prepare that. Good afternoon. I want to acknowledge some people. The vice chair of the museum, Irene Moore, is also here. And our esteemed board advisor, Robert Hughes, is also here. So thank you for coming. So yes, the Huntington African American Museum was formed in 2022. We lobbied the town council in Huntington for a plot of land. They resolved to give us a almost 2-acre site on Mill Dam Road across from the American Legion, if you know that area, that traffic circle, for 99 years. And so we are now in the process of doing a number of things. Obviously, we are raising money to build the museum. We have met with the town planning department to give them our vision of what we want to build. And so far, it's been thumbs up. We've engaged an architectural firm to create schematic drawings of that museum building, which will take us to the next level in our discussions with the planning department. We just received word that we will be receiving a 6-figure grant from the Mellon Foundation for programming. That's a portion of those funds will go towards creation of a Peter Crippen House exhibit. Some of you may know the Crippen House. It was purchased by Peter Crippen in the 1860s and stayed in his family until 2019. Yes. And it is, according to Robert, the oldest industrial building in North America. It was a grist mill dating back to the 1600s. Peter Crippen bought it in the 1860s, converted it to his family home, and the rest is history. We are going to disassemble that building, store the timbers, and incorporate that into the museum building. But what we're also going to do is we're going to do an archaeological dig, because there was an archaeological dig around the perimeter of that structure in late 2022, and that yielded 250 artifacts. And so it's clearly archaeologically significant. And so once we remove the structure, we are going to work with archaeologists to do a second dig, and hopefully that will yield even more artifacts. And so we're going to take the ones we have and the ones that we find, that we unearth, and we're going to create an exhibit. And the Heckscher Museum has graciously offered their space for the launching of that exhibit, but we're going to take it and make it a smaller project and take it to the schools.
Mm.
And so it will be a two-pronged exhibition. And we're also going to use those funds from the Mellon Foundation to expand the museum's participation in the Juneteenth celebration, the Town of Huntington Juneteenth celebration. It's typically a one-day outdoor event. We're going to try to make it a 3-day event, maybe with some lectures, some performances, and then the fair, and then maybe another screening of a significant movie at the Cinema Arts Center. So it's going to be a much larger event. So what we have planned for 2025. We are, as I said, we are doing fundraising. We've engaged a grant writer, and we are on the hunt for funds. This is going to be a significant building. We are estimating roughly a $50 million project, and so we have a lot of fundraising to do. In the meantime, we are also creating 3 new committees, which we are inviting any interested volunteers to join us and work with us. One will be called the Oral Histories Committee. There are a number of African Americans, as you know, who live here, whose grandparents, great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents live here. We want their stories. We are going to interview them on a Zoom and record them, and they will be part of our archives. So that's one committee. The second committee is the Catalog Committee. As I said, when we have 250 artifacts, we hope to have even more. We want to catalog those to make sure that they are organized and part of our permanent collection. And the third committee is the Building Committee, obviously, working with architects, working with designers, doing fundraising to raise funds to build the building. As you may know, the building, the area where we're going to build is wetlands. And so we are going to be forced to build on pillars. We're going to have to sink piles and build on pillars. So, but that's both a challenge and a blessing in that we will have about a 10-foot clearance. And if we have 2 floors, our roof deck will have a beautiful view of Huntington Harbor. And so, as most of you know, museums don't make their money on ticket sales. So we are going to have a wonderful event space that we can rent out for various organizations and individuals. So that's our plan. I invite anyone and everyone who is interested to work with us on this journey. Please let me know. You can go to our website. You can, our general mailbox is info@halfammuseum.org. And yeah, here we go. Thank you.
That's so exciting. We have, we're over, but if anybody has any questions, let's do it.
Excuse me, where can I get that print of the marching band? I would love to have that.
Does the Historical Society want to answer that? Because that's your image.
Wow, that'd be great.
Take care of it. I'll bring it to you.
Okay.
Have a couple questions from Zoom.
Mm-hmm.
So someone wants to know what's the website for the Planned Museum?
We can definitely share that with everybody. I think it's literally Huntington African American half and
HAFAM.
Yep.
And then museum. So it's museum.org.
Hopefully that works. We will keep the Zoom on and I will look on the internet to make sure I didn't mess that up. And
I can run them, right?
And Mr. Lies can help me. Yeah, so thank you. We will make sure that you get that properly. Yes.
Thomas Wood, and he died not that long ago.
Yeah.
Where did he end up living? Did he stay in Northport?
No, when he was older, I believe he was within the town of Huntington, but he was in a like a care facility, I believe. That could be totally wrong. I've forgotten that specific detail recently. But he did not stay in his house in Northport his entire life, the vast majority of his life, but not literally the whole time. Yes, far back.
Just a question about the Huntington Museum. I'm led to believe that the Cousins Lane House of Booker T. Washington, sitting on a cliff that is eroding and in pretty rough shape. And I heard a comment made about assembling a structure to become a part of the museum. You know,
Mm.
2 acres, and I just throw out there may be an opportunity to preserve some of that Booker T house and solve a number of issues.
So
I'm not sure.
whether it's inhabited or not right now, which is a completely fair and important point, but either way, what I can say is that it is definitely private property. Any discussions, would have to be with the specific owners. I know that there have been over the years discussions about knocking down the original house. Then there was a push against that, and there was some discussion about moving it closer to the street so that another house, a modern house, could be built with this the sound view. But that's it doesn't look like that has happened. So I'm not sure what the owners of that property are hoping to do there. So perhaps they would be open to other solutions related to the original building. There was another in the room question.
No, my question was about Booker T. Washington's house too, so.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's good.
And that's just a lot of information. We're all letting it sink in. We have. I'm interested in the scholarly and writerly process presented in the lecture. As a historian, what goes into gathering information for a work like this? How did texts like Thelma Jackson Abadali's help develop a frame for situating research? And what was piecing all of this together like? Thank you very much. This is my boyfriend. I'm sorry, I can't take this seriously because he's being very kind and giving me a wonderful question. I love you. Okay, no, but thank you for asking. Thank you for asking. But thank you. Let me tell you just really briefly, and then we can all have our cookies and get out of this warm room. Or keep chatting amongst ourselves, please. But so I'll tell you really briefly. As some of you have heard, I don't live in Northport anymore. I have been living in Harlem for the past 2 years. And so because I worked here, I am really lucky to have in my brain quite a few memories and just knowledge of what is in the collection here. Because I've been working on the walking tour, I already had a bunch of the pieces put together. And since 2020, 2021, I just have pages of different anecdotes, newspaper articles. We are so lucky to have it's a free website literally called New York Historic Newspapers. Free for everybody to use. The Northport Public Library has a relationship with them. They've been digitizing Northport journals, Northport Observers, the old Long Islanders are digitized, and anybody can access that from anywhere in the world. So I do a lot of follow-up research there. I spent a lot of time at my local libraries using the free Ancestry. If you're not already using it at your public library, do it. Because your taxpayer dollars are already paying for a fully operational Ancestry.com use at your public library. FamilySearch.com also is really useful. And so I look a lot at newspaper documents. I try to find the census has been a big help for me as much as humanly possible. If there are wills digitized, that's also sometimes helpful. I just haven't found a lot of them. And what I'm going to jump off from this question to say is, where does this research go next? When I was first doing this research, I was giving myself my own baseline. The further research to get more information on all of these people is definitely going to the churches here in Northport, doing more research at First Presbyterian, at the Methodist Church, at our Lutheran church in East Northport. We don't even know what treasures we're going to find in there and what pieces of the different puzzles are going to come through. The Northport East Northport oral histories have also been helpful in different ways. You can access those at the library as well. And when it comes to putting this story together, I tried very hard to keep it chronological and I hope I did an okay job of balancing the completely factual but depressing stuff with the also completely factual people living their own lives and being happy here, because there was so many opportunities for things to not be good for people of color here in Northport. And yet we know that like I said, there was so much love, and there's so many articles that I didn't get a chance to put up of, people just like, it's in the Northport Journal, it's just in the social column that they went out for a boat ride and had a great time that day. And all of their neighbors, whatever their race, color, creed, are hearing about it and like, oh, yay, good for so-and-so. They had a nice time today. And so that it wasn't just this, the African-American community was not separated in all ways from the larger, mostly white Northport community. And so, further iterations of this lecture, further publication things that might come up in my future, I just want to keep trying to broaden the understanding of what the experiences within that part of our community were. And I'm also, by the way, there's so many layers to this. The African-American history of Northport ties in so importantly to just working class history in Northport. There were many other, like I said, there were certain African-Americans who worked alongside both second generation New Yorkers and also recent immigrants. Hopefully one day it would be amazing if we could know more about that. So that's how the sausage got made. And like I said, I would be really happy to help anybody who wants to start their own local history research journey. Thank you.